set sail on this new sea, because there is new knowledge to be gained and new rights to be won, and they must be won and used for the progress of all people. But why, some say, the moon? Why choose this as our goal? And they may well ask, why climb the highest mountain? Why, 35 years ago, fly the Atlantic? We choose to go to the moon. We choose to go to the moon. We choose to go to the moon in this decade and do the other things, not because they are easy, but because they are hard. Because that goal will serve to organize and measure the best of our energies and skills. Because that challenge is one that we're willing to accept, one we are unwilling to postpone, and one we intend to win.
John F. Kennedy, 35th President of the United States. In 1961, he set a goal for the nation, that by the end of the decade, we would land a man on the moon and return him safely to Earth. That goal is now about to be achieved.
40 feet down, 2.5, picking up some dust. 30 feet, 2.5 down.
July 20th, 1969. These voices are coming from a lunar module as it descends to the moon in the frozen silence of space almost 250,000 miles from Earth. Now, at exactly 3:18 p.m., Central Daylight Earth time, the man module touches down. Instantly comes the message of which mankind has dreamed throughout the ages. In the words of Neil Armstrong,
"The Eagle has landed."
And as he steps down, the first man to touch foot to the moon, he declares,
"That's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind."
That's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind. And answering for the people of Earth, Richard Nixon, 37th President of the United States of America.
Because of what you have done, the heavens have become a part of man's world. For one priceless moment in the whole history of man, all the people on this earth are truly one.
This is a moment that many regard as second only to the creation itself, that ranks alongside man's discovery of the uses of fire, the invention of the wheel and the plow, the voyages of Marco Polo and Columbus, the fission of the atom, all turning points in time. For now, our world and our history are no longer locked into a single planet. Now, our world is all space. Our history is as wide and deep and broad as all the universe. To put our flag on the moon has taken the work of 2.5 million persons over a period of 11 years and has cost nearly $25 billion from the day our nation first decided to launch a man in space. And it has also cost the lives of 8 extraordinarily skilled and courageous astronauts who knew always what they faced.
There's always a possibility that you can have a catastrophic failure, of course. This can happen on any flight. It can happen on the last one as well as the first one. So you just plan as best you can to take care of all of these eventualities. And you get a well-trained crew and you go fly.
That was the voice of Gus Grissom, Lieutenant Colonel Virgil I. Grissom, U.S. Air Force, speaking 1 month before he and 2 fellow astronauts burned to death in a ground test of the first manned Apollo spacecraft on January 27th, 1967. A powerful little bear of a man, he had the determined courage that fights down fear. For by his own admission, Gus Grissom was often afraid, but never let that stop him from trying to reach the moon. Grissom's was but one of the many voices, tense or confident, somber or cheerful, that made history on the path to the moon. At the very first press conference where American astronauts were introduced to the world, John Glenn joked,
"My wife made a remark the other day, I've been out of this world for a long time, I might as well go on out there."
From Deke Slayton, whose destiny it became to send scores of other men into space, but be forbidden to go there himself.
I'd give my left arm to be the first man in space.
And there have been the many other voices that called across space. As stage by stage, through projects Mercury, Gemini, Apollo, our path was open to the moon. Alan Shepard.
All right, lift-off and the clock has started.
Scott Carpenter.
The sunsets are most spectacular. After the sun has set, the Earth is black. The first band close to the Earth is red. The next is yellow. The next is blue. The next is green. And the next is...
Wally Schirra.
The lightning looks like a big blob rather than a jagged streak that we're used to seeing when earthbound. It just looks like a big, almost like a...
Gordon Cooper.
Father, thank you for the success we've had in flying this flight. Thank you for the privilege of being able to be in this position, to be in this wondrous place, seeing all these many startling, wondrous things.
Ed White.
I've come above the spacecraft. I'm coming back down now. I'm under my own control. Really looks funny out there. See my glove out there, Jim.
The flight director says get back in.
This is Jim. What, got any message for us?
Jimmy Ford, get back in.
Okay.
Pete Conrad.
We're looking straight down over Australia now. We have the Terminator out our right window. We have the whole northern part of the world out one window. Utterly fantastic.
Frank Borman.
The moon is a different thing to each one of us. I think that each one carries his own impressions of what he's seen today. I know my own impression is that it's a vast, lonely, forbidding type existence or expanse of nothing.
A medley of American voices. The Hoosier twang of Indiana. The even level of prairie speech. The soft accent of the South. The precise articulation of New England. All speaking plain American. But all becoming a little hushed, a little awed, as ever they approach nearer and nearer the moon.
Queen of the heavens, the lover's star, night lamp in the sky, the sweet surprise of heaven.
From the moment the first man looked upward in the night, the moon has been an object of wonder to all the races of the earth. The Greeks and Romans worshipped the moon as a goddess, under such sacred names as Phoebe, Cynthia, Artemis, Diana.
Fortune tellers studied the moon to predict the future. Farmers planted their crops according to the phases of the moon. It was long believed to be a cause of lunacy.
It has been the subject of countless thousands of poems in all languages, and almost as many American pop songs.
For ages, the moon has been regarded as a symbol of chastity, yet was thought to be able to set lovers on fire.
From the beginning of time, people on Earth have fancied they could see a man in the moon. Now, suddenly, there is one.
Question: how old is the moon?
The Bible says that God made the moon on the fourth day of creation. Scientists guess that it's about 4 or 5 billion years old.
Question: how did it come into existence?
Some think it was thrown into space. Others believe it rolled together like a vast snowball from bits and pieces of cosmic debris called meteorites. But this we know for certain, that as long as mankind has existed, we've reached out for the moon, like a child for an enchanting ball. And the moon has ever reached back toward us, trying to pull us toward it with a force that we can see in the rising tides of all the rivers and oceans of the earth. So it would seem that from the beginning, the moon and we were made for each other. But the moment it's proposed that we send a man to the moon, objections come from all sides. Many ask, of what possible use is it?
What is the use of a newborn child?
This was the answer of Benjamin Franklin, discoverer of electricity, when asked in his own time, what is the use of this invention? For ages, man has envied the bird its wings.
Icarus, in the Greek fable, flew from the earth with feathered wings attached to him by wax. but the wax melted near the sun, and he fell to his death.
There is a legend that 5 centuries ago, Wan Hu, a Chinese mandarin, discovered the principle of reactive power that drives such rockets as Atlas, Titan, and Saturn V in our own time. Wan Hu worked out a plan to fly to the moon sitting on a chair between 2 enormous kites that would be powered by 47 slow-burning skyrockets. And that's all a booster really is. A super rocket with its motor pointed earthward. As the fuel burns, gases shoot downward, and the booster lifts upward with exactly the same force. Newton's third law, that for every action, there is an equal and opposite reaction. Now back to Wan Hu. Since he was never again seen on Earth, maybe he did make it to the moon.
Flight into space, even to the moon, was the dream also of a long-nosed French swordsman and poet called Cyrano de Bergerac in the 1600s, and of Voltaire, Edgar Allan Poe, Jules Verne, Edward Everett Hale.
But until the turn of this century, rockets remained pretty earthbound. They were used as toys that brought oohs and ahs at fireworks displays, as distress signals, as a way to throw a life-saving line from shore to ship, and as a kind of artillery called the Congreve rocket. And with Congreves, for instance, the British assaulted Fort McHenry in the War of 1812. Turn of the century. The gas buggy has only about started to chase the horse from the streets. But already, 3 great rocket pioneers are working on the feasibility of sending a man into space. There is an awesome prophecy in the nationalities of these 3 men. For they represent the 3 great powers that within half a century will be competing in the vast, fierce race into space. In 1899, Konstantin Tsiolkovsky, a Russian high school teacher, even more obscure than the town where he lives, declares in an article that will not find a publisher till years later, "The Earth is the cradle of the mind, but one cannot live forever in a cradle." To set foot on the soil of the asteroids, to lift by hand a rock from the moon. From the moment of using rocket devices, a great new era will begin. 4 years later, in 1903, Tsiolkovsky finally achieves a hearing with publication of his book, The Exploration of Planetary Space with Reactive Equipment. Soon after, an American high school student, Robert Goddard, declares in his graduation address, "It is difficult to say what is impossible, for the dream of yesterday is the hope of today and the reality of tomorrow." By 1916, Goddard has become a physics teacher and has carried experiments to the point of firing homemade solid-fuel rockets. He writes an article entitled, "A Method of Reaching Extreme Altitude," which the Smithsonian Institution publishes in late 1919.
Today I will speak about the proposal for an electric spaceship that doesn't use ants.
That is the actual voice of the 3rd great space pioneer, Professor Hermann Oberth, speaking before a group of distinguished scientists and engineers. In a 1923 pamphlet, The Rocket into Interplanetary Space, Oberth makes some wild predictions that someday it will be possible to orbit a large manned rocket around the Earth, that passengers will leave it in a smaller landing rocket, visit another planet, and go home the same way. A Russian, an American, a German, all working with pencil and paper to solve the problems of flight to the moon. The Russian schoolteacher builds his country's first wind tunnel, Also, he studies the possibility of liquid fuels, solves the theoretical problems of how to escape and re-enter the Earth's atmosphere. And even under the repressions of the czarist and communist regimes, government funds are granted for the publication of 58 books by him. Goddard, in his landmark paper, has speculated about using the implications of Newton's third law, action and reaction, to send a rocket to the moon. The country laughs and calls him the Moon Man. The New York Times comments
that Professor Goddard, with his chair in Clark College and the countenancing of the Smithsonian Institution, does not know the relation of action to reaction and of the need to have something better than a vacuum against which to react. To say that would be absurd. Of course, he only seems to lack the knowledge ladled out daily in high schools. But there are such things as intentional.
the 1920s, the Jazz Age, the era of wonderful nonsense. From 1919 to 1925, the American professor, now working with liquid fuel motors, explores stabilization apparatus, the multi-stage rocket, self-cooling motors, pumps for the liquid fuel, practical landing devices, and quietly patents many of these ideas. But by 1924, Russia also has set up the Central Bureau for the Study of the Problems of Rockets. And in Germany,
because the velocity is not...
Professor Oberth envisions an instrument-carrying rocket that is a prediction of the spaceships of the future. He develops a rocket motor, called the Egg, that will help lead the way to the power plants of all the large rockets of today. 1926, Auburn, Massachusetts. The world pays little or no attention to Robert Goddard's history-making launch of the first liquid fuel rocket. As his widow recalls,
it was March 16th, a cold day, but fortunately no wind. My husband had an igniter at the head of the rocket, and Mr. Sachs had a blowtorch on a stick and applied the blowtorch to start the rocket. The rocket itself was lightweight aluminum, bit almost like a toy, and even now people marvel at the quality of the parts in it. This first flight took a little long to get started, but when the jet came, it was brilliantly white and beautiful and smokeless. And it made exactly the same kind of noise that you hear now on a small scale. It went up, I think, probably 50 or 60 feet, and then angled off and landed in a cabbage patch with very old cabbages in it in March.
Mrs. Goddard later wrote that the rocket actually reached an altitude of 41 feet, was in the air for 2.5 seconds, averaging 60 miles per hour, and landed 184 feet from the launch frame. As always, she served as her husband's official photographer. A year later, in 1927, a handful of dreamers in Germany formed the Society for Space Travel. And a few years later, a similar handful of American rocket devotees, meeting in a New York apartment above a speakeasy, give themselves the imposing name of the American Interplanetary Society. And two members, G. Edward Pendray and his wife, go to observe the German rocket tests.
Willy Ley took us out to a suburb of Berlin where the German Rocket Society had what they called a proving ground. And now there they had a somewhat crude but effective device for testing liquid fuel rocket motors. And there we saw the first liquid fuel rocket motor we had ever seen in operation. We were so filled with enthusiasm by this sight and the simplicity of it and the obvious power of it that when Mrs. Pender and I got back to the United States, we made what was apparently a very impressive report to the Society. And the Society immediately decided to go into an experimental program of its own. And about a dozen of us began to design a rocket. The first of our rockets...
Not only is there American interest, but the German Space Society also attracts the attention of Walter Dornberger, then a young German Army ordnance captain with a PhD in mechanical engineering. He will head his country's rocket effort from 1930 up to the end of World War II. By then, Major General Dornberger.
We in the Army, at that time, we were listening and reading about all this rocket endeavor. And we came together and thought maybe here is a way where we can circumvent the conditions of the Treaty of Versailles, which prevented Germany from developing any new weapons. They had prohibited all kinds of heavy weapons, destructive weapons, but they had forgotten the rocket, and they had forgotten the glider. In these two areas we concentrated. I made round trips to all of these little inventors, and we supported them with money, more than they could ever from civilian sources, but it was a failure. We had to do it ourselves. And as I finally convinced my boss, the chief of the German Board of Ordnance, General Becker, he gave me the means to do it, and he reserved a small location in the proving ground near Berlin, in Kummersdorf, where we set up our facilities. And here we finally put together some of the inventors who realized that they couldn't make any headway, and we hired them as employees, engineers, and we finally were in the year of 1932 a group of 6 or 8 people. Among them was von Braun. Von Braun at that time was a student at the university in Zurich, Switzerland, but I hired him and he came to us and joined us. We were not interested in the 6 decimal behind the comma of a flight path to Mars or Venus. We were not interested in accuracy or anything like that. We wanted first to prove what could be done with that thing, and that was a power plant.
But the 1930s are a time of depression. In America, the government worries about how to give people bread, not power plants for rockets. Although the Guggenheim family does make funds available for further testing to Goddard and to the California Institute of Technology. The name of the American Interplanetary Society, which causes skepticism in some quarters by seeming to take in the whole universe, is changed to the more modest American Rocket Society. Nevertheless, Pendray, seeking help from Washington, runs into roadblocks.
During this entire period from 1930 onward until the Second World War, there were numerous attempts to interest the NACA, the Army and the Navy, and later the Air Force in developing rockets. Their reaction generally to any approach was, well, if you say rockets will do these wonderful things, build us a rocket that will and bring it to us, and then we'll talk contract. This made, of course, an impasse, because what we needed was money in order to do the development, and what they wanted was the development completed in order to evaluate it.
Also, he meets a grave scientific objection from the Director of Flight Research at the National Advisory Committee for Aeronautics.
So I talked to Dr. Lewis at the time. He spent a whole afternoon proving to me that nothing could fly faster than the speed of sound. He covered a blackboard with mathematics, proving something that I knew wasn't true, but his mathematics was more profound than mine. So we got nowhere. We presently saw, after a year or so, that if anything was to be done, we'd have to do it ourselves.
The first day of September, 1939. Speaking at the Berlin Sports Palace, Adolf Hitler launches a war game unlike anything the world has ever known. World War II. Poland is overrun in a matter of days. The following spring, France is defeated in 6 weeks, and England reels under the greatest air attacks in history. By 1941, Russia, its back to the wall, fights with masses of men and conventional weapons, except for the Katyusha, an artillery rocket, the first practical result of her highly advanced rocket theories. The United States military put their main scientific thrust into the Manhattan Project to create the atomic bomb. The long-standing NACA is limited by law almost entirely to airplane research. However, at a wartime staff meeting, even when rockets are mentioned, a top executive ends the discussion with the historic declaration, "You can have the Buck Rogers job." In Germany, the rocket scientists, now established at a secret army experimental station at Peenemünde on the Baltic, have their priorities canceled. Dornberger pleads for military funds and gets permission from the chief of the German army to grab from frontline troops 8,000 engineers and technicians who had been drafted for combat duty. Hitler disregards the war potential of rockets, and so dooms himself to defeat. Historic account.
And we, against the wish of Hitler, we proceeded with our work in Peenemünde for years. And when it was finally finished, and we had the first launching, successful launchings, Professor Speer, the ammunition minister, went to Hitler's headquarters and told him that this thing seemed to be ready now. And he wanted more money and top priority. And Hitler told him, no, yesterday you sent me some schedule, what you want to talk about, and I dreamed about last night, and I dreamed that this weapon would never reach England. And therefore it's no use to give any money. I can trust my thinking.
Late in the day, Hitler, realizing his mistake, makes one of the few apologies of his life to General Dornberger. And in July 1943, orders crash production of that supersonic rocket missile, the A-4. It's the second of a series of airborne weapons that propaganda minister Goebbels calls Vergeltungswaffen, or revenge weapons, to bombard London in reprisal for Allied air raids on Germany. The world comes to know it as the V-2.